Hi, Grace. How's it
Hello.
going? Welcome.
Thanks.
We're going to give it 2 more minutes for folks to trickle in, and then we're also waiting for Ishita.
There she is.
Hi, Ishita. Welcome.
Just doing a quick audio check. You guys can hear me okay? And
Yep.
right.
Loud and clear.
Nice.
I'm going to start the recording right before Jade kicks off the event.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jay McClelland, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our Neural Networks for Cognition discussion group. This discussion group was originally initiated at Cognitive Science 2 years ago, so this is the third iteration of this, and I'm pleased to have been able to bring people together during the pandemic to discuss some of the amazing breakthroughs and questions that are arising about neural networks over the last few years as we've been working in physical isolation, if not in total, conceptual isolation from each other. So this year, we're having the third annual occurrence of this event, which is now called Neural Nets for Cognition. And it's a combination online today and in person next week event associated with the Cognitive Science meeting. So let me begin by acknowledging and thanking my co-organizers this year. First of all, I want to mention Kanishka, who I wasn't really sure we were going to have this meeting this year, but he sort of sent me a little email and prompted me to think that we should do it. So here we are, and thank you for that, Kanishka. Kanishka is also hosting the Zoom at his University of Purdue, and has been really, really helpful in helping us get everything going here. I want to thank Felix Binder, who's a student in Judy Fan's lab, who's been amazingly helpful with getting all the technical side of things going and setting up our online presence. And so thanks for that, Felix. Really appreciate that. And last but not least, I want to thank my co-conspirator here, Judy Fan. It's really been very exciting to be part of a field where so many young very, very talented cognitive scientists from diverse backgrounds of all different kinds have come into our field and started moving the field forward in new and excitingly different ways. And so I'm really pleased to have Judy as the overall co-organizer of the event and as the main organizer of today's event, our sort of plenary, if you like, discussion session, which will be on the question, a question we worded very, very carefully over many, many emails. How can we tell how well a neural network is emulating human behavior? Okay, so thanks everyone for being here. And Judy, over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Jay, and thank you all for being here. I'd be remiss if I didn't also give a special shout out to you, Jay, for bringing us together year after year. This has been a real highlight of the CogSci meeting for the last few years, and I'm so glad that we could have it again this year in this hybrid format. Without further ado, okay, so we're delighted to be joined by 4 panelists today. Jacob Andreas, assistant professor at MIT in EECS and CSAIL. Ishita Dasgupta, research scientist at DeepMind. Grace Lindsay, research fellow at UCL, soon to be assistant professor of psychology and data science at New York University. And Ellie Pavlik, assistant professor of computer science at Brown, as well as a research scientist at Google AI. I've just listed your names, panelists, in alphabetical order by last name. If you wouldn't mind also providing your introductory statements in that order, I'll cue you when we get there. We just want to give you a heads up about the sequencing. A couple other logistical notes before we dive in. So the official duration of this call is 1 hour. So we'll signal that an hour has elapsed at the end. So if you need to go at the hour, that's perfectly fine. We'll begin with approximately 5-minute introductory statements from each panelist, really informal, followed by moderated discussion, okay? And I will be moderating that part. If you are here and you have a burning question, feel free to raise it. That's why we're here. Please raise your hand to do so, and I will call on you when we get to that portion of the event. We will keep the room for 30 minutes longer to allow more informal discussion to continue. So towards the end, if the mood is right, we might create breakout rooms to allow more casual conversation among attendees here, to give everyone a chance to meet new people and interact with one another, especially those of you who won't be able to travel to Toronto next week. And as also a preview of the in-person experience for those of you who are traveling. Timekeeping during the first part will be fairly casual. Felix is also keeping time and letting me know how things are going. But we do hope, panelists, that you'll aim to keep your statements under 5 minutes if possible. If we get to the point where it's really time to move on, I'll make little gestures here in my thumbnail, you can see, to indicate that it would be great to transition to the next phase of the event. And but I'll try to do my refrain from interrupting you during your comments. The main reason for that is to save enough time for the interactive portion of the event. Okay, so let us begin with Jacob. If you'd like to take it away.
Thank you. Share my screen here. Is this working? Okay, cool. Yeah, so, thanks again so much for inviting me. I'm, mostly live in the NLP world, but I'm getting more and more interested in these kinds of cognitive questions. So it's super, fun to meet all of you and looking forward to the discussion. So Yeah, I mean, I work on natural language processing, and like everybody, I think, who works on natural language processing, I've been thinking a lot recently about the kinds of things that we can do with big probabilistic models of language. And so, one of the sort of big things that's happened in this field in the last couple of years is that we've, suddenly find ourselves with really, really good predictive models of text. Here's an example of one of these things in action. This example was taken from an article by Marcus and Davis. I think the original prompt is actually from Eugene Charniak's PhD thesis, like way back in the day. Says the following: Janet and Penny went to the store to get presents for Jack. Janet said, "I will buy Jack a top." "Don't get Jack a top," said Penny. "He has a top." And if you ask a language model to complete this passage, it says, "Get a top, I will get a top," or "I will get Jack a top," said Janet. And there are a couple of things that are remarkable about this generation, right? One is that it looks pretty good, right? It knows who the participants are in this conversation. It knows enough about social conventions to know that it's Janet who's likely to speak next. It knows that we're sort of talking about a talk and whether to get Jack a top or not. The other thing that's remarkable about this passage is that it's complete nonsense, and that the sort of generation that we're getting here is not the kind of conversation that we would actually expect sort of normal human participants to engage in. And so a sort of natural question is, to the extent that this works, what is the model doing under the hood that allows it to do all of these things that we weren't able to do with n-gram models, that we weren't even able to do with smaller sort of neural language models? And to the extent that it doesn't work, can we understand in sort of mechanistic terms what it is that the model is doing that's causing those errors? And the sort of particular angle we've been taking on this lately is through the lens of meaning. And as models are solving these kinds of generation problems, are they doing them by just building sort of shallow surface statistical models of text, or are they sort of representing and reasoning about the world that the text is describing in order to figure out what words are allowed to come next? We have a little bit of work in this direction showing that there do in fact seem to be behaviors that look at least a little bit like structured simulation of world states. You can do things like read properties of entities off of their mentions in documents. You can actually sort of manipulate those entities in predictable ways with predictable effects on downstream language generation. So we can sort of, by taking pieces of representations from these language models in different places, stitch them together to construct representations of novel states of the world that were never described in text, and still get language models to generate sort of text that's coherent and consistent with those fictitious world states that we've constructed. At the same time, as we saw in that first slide, these models still make lots of mistakes. There's still all kinds of errors that they make that are, sort of not consistent with actually forming reliable representations of the way the world works, simulation of situations that are being described in text. And yeah, so, I think one important scientific challenge is just this set of questions that we put up here. Can we, is it the case that neural network models of language are human-like in the sort of narrow sense of thinking about meaning and building representations of meaning that maybe even look like the kinds of meaning representations that are hypothesized to support human language processing? Or is there something else shallower going on, or just something fundamentally different going on? And if so, can we sort of apply the techniques of interpretability that NLP and machine learning more broadly have developed in the last couple of years to understand what's going on here? And I'll wrap up there.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Ishita?
All right, let me try this.
Hey, Ishita, you're muted.
Yeah, for some reason it's not letting me. The moment I try to share it, it mutes me, which is interesting. And it says that this is intended behavior. It says when you're sharing your screen, we're going to mute you, which sounds odd. Anyway, so I'm going to just try to wing it without the slides for now. I think it's just a few minutes, so I'll just say what I meant to say without slides. Okay, so My background is actually a large part of the research I did in the past was mostly in computational cognitive science. So an idea there that I used a lot, which I thought was an interesting idea that I think has implications for understanding neural networks as well, is to think really carefully about the kinds of mistakes that we see humans make. That, there are a lot of, there's like one way to be right, but there's a million ways to be wrong. So like exactly the kinds of ways that people make mistakes are actually really interesting to think about the actual processes they're using to get to the answers that they're trying to get to. So I've used this method in the past to, for example, say that if there's specific kinds of noise added to an algorithm, they'll predict various kinds of deviations from normativity. So what does that tell us about the kind of processes that are actually going on under the hood when we're trying to study human behavior? So more recently, I've been also thinking about this as an approach to try to understand some neural network models as well. So specifically, a few years ago, there was this project that I worked on, which was looking basically at how whether neural networks are what we would call compositional. So what I mean by compositional is like it's a very broadly defined term, right? Like it could mean a lot of different things. So I'm going to just say one specific version of that, which is basically saying things like, if X is taller than me, then I am not taller than X, right? Like an X can kind of be anything. Like I'm composing, like I don't need to, like if I now say X is the thin man with the red hat that just walked past me, that sentence is still true. If X is the mushroom, that's still true. So like this statement is true kind of independent of the value of those of X. So we had kind of looked at whether existing sentence representations captured this sort of this behavior, that like if it's true for certain contexts, it should be true for other values of X. If it's true for certain X, it should be true for other X. And we found sort of interesting behaviors that if you add to training data if you augment training data in specific ways, you can get, this was before even transformers, so this was a little while ago, but you can actually get this kind of behavior, but you get interesting mistakes. So what I mean by interesting mistakes is that these models actually generalize to new X's that it hasn't seen before, better than it generalizes to X's that they have seen before, but just in a different context. So it's kind of an interesting idea where like you see that like having seen specific values of X before sometimes messes up your abstract reasoning. And so this was pre-transformers. Actually, just last week, we put up a paper on arXiv looking at language models and whether they replicate some of these. Jay also knows about this work and is part of it. It was co-led with a co-author of mine, Andrew Lampinen, whom some of you might know. So basically what we studied was looking at whether pre-existing beliefs about these X's and Y's over which we're trying to do this abstract reasoning actually influence our ability to do this reasoning. So there's a host of human data showing that these belief biases, where basically your beliefs about these X strongly influence your abstract reasoning about these X and Y. We tried to replicate those, see if pre-trained language models, large pre-trained language models replicated some of those beliefs. And we were very interested to find that in fact they do. And there's a lot of, in a range of different tasks like natural language inference, syllogistic reasoning, the Wason card selection task, that the language model seems to replicate the kinds of errors specifically that we see in human judgments in these logical reasoning tasks. So I think that's like, so I think that raises sort of interesting questions, both about, like, it seems like a really interesting place for exchange, because both it allows us to think about whether these kinds of large neural network models can provide insight into how humans also end up with these sort of biased or, specific kinds of reasoning where they're really optimal in some cases and sort of predictably biased in certain other cases. I think it's also really interesting to think about how models that we have in cognitive science might help us understand these inner workings a little bit more. There are models in things like cognitive control that talk about how like attention-mediated methods can tell you whether you should be doing a specific kind of algorithm or another kind of algorithm, and maybe that can give us some insights into these like big transformer-like models that seem to be showing a lot of these interesting emergent behaviors. Yeah, so basically my like sort of short takeaway is that I think like mistakes are actually a really interesting thing to look at.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to chew on. Great. Floor is yours.
Great, thanks. I don't have slides, but I'm just going to share kind of a quick story about a recent research project I did that kind of speaks to this question of how do you decide if a neural network is behaving like a human. So I usually use artificial neural networks to model human and more broadly primate visual processing. And so a project that I did recently at UCL was focused on recurrence in the visual system and the role that recurrent connections play, because a lot of the basic models of visual processing like convolutional neural networks are usually feed forward, but obviously recurrence exists very widely in the visual system. So going into it, I wanted to base the model on behaviors that are widely observed and kind of very strongly found in the psychophysics literature. I wanted to build an artificial neural network that used recurrence to replicate some of the behaviors that we think recurrence is playing a role in humans. And so I built these models that had different types of recurrence in them. I won't get into the details of the different types of recurrence, but the goal was to build these models, show that they replicate the behavior, and then study the neural dynamics of them. And so these behaviors that I highlighted were basically if the model is shown a non-degraded image, it should be able to classify it in a single time step, because that corresponds to behavioral findings that feed-forward vision can do simple classification in about 25 to 50 milliseconds. So people think of that as like a one feed-forward pass through the visual system. And then the recurrence comes in when you have more degraded images. So adding different types of noise to the image, then people need more time to process it. So the model should also show that when you add stronger and stronger noise to the model, the performance should go down. It shouldn't be good at classifying noisy images. And then when you add more recurrent steps, that performance should be recovered. So the recurrence is countering the noise. It's somehow like getting rid of the noise in the image and letting the network classify correctly. So those are the three behavioral findings I wanted the model to match before I would consider it acceptable to study as a model of these neural dynamics. And so I built these models, and I was able to find different types of recurrence that can replicate all of those behaviors, at least qualitatively. But then I realized that some of the models that I had trained, I had to put in the number of time steps in training, and it replicated these findings up until those time steps. But if I let it run past those time steps, the performance would become terrible. And so that was a little tricky, because I thought I was being a good scientist because I had decided in advance what my criteria was. I had these 3 points and the models replicated it, but then poking around a little bit more, they don't replicate things that I know, even without looking at the literature, that humans can do. If you stare at a picture for longer, you don't get worse at knowing what's in it. So that was clearly not human-like behavior that they were displaying. And the question is, does it matter? I mean, no model is going to be perfect. So can I say that it's capturing something about humans in these first couple of time steps that I fit the model to, and then not worry about the fact that it goes off the rails later on? Or is this a fundamental difference in how the network is using recurrence such that it's not a useful model of human visual processing? And so my goal, as I said, was to make these models so that I could then study their neural dynamics. And so that's another way to do the comparison, is not just at the behavioral level, but at the neural dynamics level. And so I was able to do some comparisons there, and it does seem like these models aren't very human-like or primate-like in their recurrent processing, even though they do match these 3 different these behavioral criteria that I set out. But then, of course, you again get this problem even at the neural data level, in the sense of, well, they're like the neural activity in some ways and they're dislike it in other ways, and which ones matter and what counts and when is a model good enough and all of that. So yeah, I think my kind of takeaway to this question is, you can do it at the behavioral level and at the neural level, and having both is good. But no matter what, even if you come in with strict criteria, there's going to be extra bits to the model that aren't going to fit exactly, and you have to decide for your purposes if that's good enough for the modeling that you're interested in doing, and the motivation you have in going into trying to make artificial neural networks that work like humans.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Grace. And Ellie.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to share slides. This is like stripped down from a much longer talk, so I'll just kind of skip through quickly, and I will try not to take too long. So I also wanted to talk about the compositionality issue. I'm like Jacob coming from the NLP side. And so typically this is kind of at the center of, I think, when NLP people talk about stuff that's kind of cognitive science adjacent, compositionality has been the main theme. And the reason I think compositionality is important here is because it gives us this nice example of I think the type of methods and experiments that we need to be able to do and we're not great at doing right now in neural network research. So there's lots of definitions of compositionality, as people have talked about. I think some of these are more interesting kind of intellectually to debate than others. And so the ones that I kind of conjure up the most interest are these kinds of definitions that aren't obviously compatible with neural networks, right? So it's not a weak definition, like it's just a function of the parts, but we're looking at something where we have some definition of compositionality that requires that these kind of different ideas or different thoughts or different sentences are kind of built from the same components, right? So the cat on the mat and the mat on the cat are built up from the same parts, but have fundamentally different meanings. And so we need, and so we want to ask whether a neural network model can kind of meet this kind of definition. And so this is kind of a good example of the type of hypothesis we would need to test to ask questions about whether neural networks are replicating humans. Is we have some candidate definition of what we're claiming humans do, in this case, this kind of compositionality definition. And currently the best kinds of evaluations we have tend to be these kind of behavioral systematic generalization tasks. So we would look at something like, okay, if we train the model on blue square and red circle, and now we test it and it can label a blue circle as a blue circle, then that's evidence it had this compositional representation under the hood. And so the issue right now is that these kinds of tests don't actually help us in deciding whether the neural network is consistent with this definition. They're not really sufficient because there's, for a number of reasons. One is that often we don't really have control over the training data for the models that are very impressive. So the large models, sometimes this is a dumb reason, right? Like they're proprietary, but even if we assume that we have open source versions, it's actually just practically quite infeasible to retrain or remove or directly inspect these large training data. So when a model says that something's a blue circle, we don't know if it's getting it right because it actually just saw blue circles in training, or something else, like it's using some types of heuristics. And there's a lot of really good work on controlling for these types of heuristics. Alison Edinger comes to mind, as I just always love her work on this. But it can actually be really hard to control for these heuristics because they might be kind of live in a conceptual space that humans don't readily think about. And so we can never be entirely sure whether the model is generalizing for the right reasons or using some tricks. Tom McCoy, who I saw here, has also done really good work on this. The other issue is that we can't think about kind of unseen inputs in the way we could with symbolic systems. So these models all live in or take representations in distributed space now. And so even though the literal input it's getting is going to be unseen, it's going to live in a dimension of seen spaces. So you're always kind of interpolating within this space of stuff that you have seen. And so the kind of significance of a held out input doesn't have the same weight that it did in these kinds of theories. And with, I think a lot of cognitive science research kind of traditionally thinks about this. And so we have these success stories where maybe the model is able to say blue circle because it's saying it's kind of between red circle and blue square. But that same kind of reasoning procedure could also allow us to generalize to 2, having seen 1 and 3. And I think these are kind of qualitatively very different types of representations and processes that we would like our evaluation to differentiate between. And it's also important to point out that this kind of behavior isn't actually necessary for meeting our definition. So obviously compositional systems can make mistakes. We can have bad perception, for example, and if my model says this is a red circle, that doesn't mean that its system wasn't compositional. It just means maybe it had bad vision and it thought that it was red when in fact it was blue, but the subsequent reasoning made sense. And they can also be subject to things like strong training priors, right? Like I think probably the best example we have of these kinds of highly compositional like systems would be some of these Bayesian kind of language of thought types of models that are very subject to training priors. And so the fact that a model might spit out something that's on training doesn't necessarily mean it didn't reason compositionally. So I think if I have to kind of sum up what I think are the biggest challenge for the kinds of questions we're trying to ask in this discussion group is that we need to do hypothesis-driven research. And I think almost always the types of things we care about are framed in terms of representations. And we don't actually have really good ways of directly evaluating representations right now. I won't talk about specifically. My student Charlie's been doing some work here, and Jacob kind of alluded to this type of work, but we've been trying to think of, and NLP has been doing a lot of work, machine learning has been doing a lot of work on interpretability to try to kind of get in under the hood and figure out what's going on within a neural network to evaluate representations. And we've gotten a lot of positive results for trying to test whether models meet some definitions of conversationality. But I'll just throw out that like these, some of these key ones, they're still just we're in very early stages of having the right tools. So I'll just go back to that point that I think the main challenge right now is, I think we know kind of where we need to go is we need these representational evaluations. We have some ideas for how we might do it, but they're definitely not vetted. They're not standardized. We shouldn't just take the results from them as given, right? Because we need to trust our tools if we're going to then draw conclusions based on them. But I think that's, to me, the one of the really hard questions right now is what exactly do we need to demand from these evaluations? What are we going to expect from them? How we use them? How do we validate that they are good before we then go and make claims about neural nets being human-like, for example? And yeah, I will end there.
Thanks so much, Ellie. And if now as we transition to the open discussion portion of the event, I'd actually like to pick up from the thread that you just began pulling on, Ellie, in your comments. In particular, just thinking about what the what the standards are for determining the degree to which any given neural network model is emulating human behaviors, behaving in a human-like way. I'll take maybe one of the more provocative bullet points from your closing slide, that behavior alone is insufficient. And I'd be curious to hear from the other panelists to what extent you agree with that statement, or if you have a different perspective, if you could share your thoughts.
Well, I guess I can, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll let someone else go first because I just had the last word on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I think, for many of the same reasons that Ellie articulated, right, which is that in practice, the models that we have today that are most human-like are models that are trained in a way that sort of makes them incompatible with like science as we're accustomed to doing science, right? That we typically don't have sort of full control over the training data. Sometimes we don't have visibility into the training data, and that it is therefore very difficult both to, identify the like full space of potential compounds or confounds, and even to, sort of make distinctions between what's been seen and what hasn't been seen before. And, I think one thing that's important there is the fact that, when we evaluate these models, we care so much about generalization, right? That, any particular set of stimuli that you want to explain, you can memorize. And so these, questions about whether a neural net is like doing the right thing are well defined really only with respect to some held out piece of data. And we now live in a world where for the models where we will most sort of care about knowing what's held out, it is very, very difficult to know that now. And I think, there's room for building better tools and building things that, just on the sort of engineering side, let us answer questions like, are there examples of this particular phenomenon or this particular, lexical item or this particular collocation or whatever in the data set, and that there are, sort of like interesting research problems just in figuring out how to make it possible to answer this question in the first place. But I think even if we had the tools to do it, what you really want is full control over the training data. And I think we now live in a world where we're never going to have full control over the training data again.
Can I ask a naive question about that? How do you study compositionality and these kinds of things in humans when you don't know their training data? How do you know that they haven't memorized things?
I think that's like a really valid point to bring up, is we take it for granted, right? And I think that this is coming up a bit in, so I use like the Fodorian definition of compositionality because I think it's interesting to ask how would we test those hypotheses. I personally don't think that that is a good model of how humans are processing language, for example, right? And there's a lot of examples in linguistics, and actually Ishita just gave some nice examples of how, people don't have this bottom-up, purely compositional, context agnostic kind of a process running. And so I think there's kind of in my mind, there's two different, both very important questions that it's worth decoupling. One is we need to be able to evaluate the representations of a neural network in order to test hypotheses about those representations, right? The other is like a question of, are humans compositional? And I think those both need to be true, right? I think saying we need to evaluate the representations of neural networks does not entail saying this is because they have this like pure logical, or humans have this pure logical system or something like that. And so there's a whole separate question I think to be grappled with, which is, are humans compositional? How do we know they're compositional? And that's subject to the same issues, I think, that neural networks.
Right. And yeah, I totally agree. And I think I think one of the things that I thought about as a sort of subtlety that is coming up a little bit more and more with these like larger models now is that like even the notion of representation, like whether it's representation that's been like that there are multiple ways in which even humans represent information, right? Like I think sort of the implicit assumption in a lot of these behavioral experiments is that even if somebody did this experiment of some kind like 10 years ago, they've forgotten about it, right? Like that this isn't necessary. It's part of the general way in which they approach problems, but they don't necessarily remember this exact stimulus. And the reason that we justify that is because humans have different memory systems, that they have like working memory or episodic memory or long-term memory. And we sort of make implicit assumptions about which part has to have seen that information for it to interfere with our experiment. And I'm curious about like how like that, like even in, so one of the ways that we've been trying to, like maybe I'm curious about people's thoughts about things like in these large language model transformer type systems, which have basically eaten the internet. Do people think that if we create, so for example, like new bindings in context, right? Like within the context window of a transformer and how it sort of like uses the information that we've explicitly provided, where in some sense it's concrete, like, it cannot have that information elsewhere. Like I'm providing it in that context window. Obviously there's still a small probability that exactly that string has appeared somewhere else on the internet and it's actually recovering it from the weights. But I'm sort of like moving the direction, like I was sort of curious about whether people think that thinking about representations at different levels might be one way to start thinking about it, that you might have different memory systems and therefore different representation systems, and what are the different ways you might be able to study those different systems.
Okay, and I see your hand if you'd like to provide a comment here.
Yeah, my comment is similar to Grace's, and I just want to build on it a tiny bit more. The notion that language is compositional is something that Chomsky and Fodor have given to us, and Fodor in particular is so vigorous and sort of persuasive in his presentation of these ideas, but the facts have never really been consistent with this view, right? The facts of how we interpret sentences. So, a sentence like, she felt the baby kick, is not something you can understand from a compositional point of view when you realize that it's referring to a situation in which a woman is just experiencing the first movement of her unborn child in her womb, and so when we ask the question, what interpretation do people give of sentences that violate compositionality but make sense if you think the syntax was wrong, you find that often enough, they are actually completely violating the syntactic constraints and agreeing with what makes sense semantically, right? And so, you know, figuring out to what extent, so what makes it interesting though is that we can be compositional under certain circumstances, and this is where the work that Ishida was talking about, and in particular, a part of it that she didn't mention so much, but involving like the Wason type inference schemas, where, you know, it's really the capability of reasoning correctly using the logical kind of implications of the if-then statements that become accessible when you have access to the content of the situations that are being referred to in those settings. So I guess I would like to ask Jacob a question in this context, because he's kind of was talking so much about meaning at the beginning. And, you know, as I've been emphasizing here, I think that in order to correctly determine the meaning of a sentence, you must go far beyond anything that compositional syntax can offer. And certainly Barbara Partee has made that point very clearly in her, you have to read the appendix to find it, but that's what she doesn't think that compositionality is going to tell us how people understand the meanings of sentences. So I just was interested to hear a little bit more about how you think about that in your own work on meaning in particular.
Sorry, let me. Okay, Judy has given me permission to respond out of order here. So yeah, I mean, so I think that there's a couple of pieces of this, which I think Ellie sort of identified before, right? Which is, are you thinking about compositionality as like a constraint on, or a characterization of like the computational mechanism that a model is using to make predictions, or are you using it as a characterization of the data distribution that you're trying to model? And, you know, I think when, at least, you know, in our work, when we've been thinking about these questions about compositionality, what makes it interesting to me is that, you know, we do have examples of data sets. I'm thinking of things like Brendan Lake and Tal Linzen's like colors data set, where you give a bunch of people some toy language learning task, you show them a bunch of sequences that are not part of the toy language learning task. They like mostly generalize in the same set of ways to interpretations of novel stimuli. And there's something there to be explained. And it seems like one way of explaining it is in terms of, you know, writing down something that looks like a grammar or some sort of compositional interpretation process, just as a distribution of the kinds of, as a description of the kinds of human behaviors that you're trying to explain. Now, whether under the hood, you know, there's actually some sort of like parsing algorithm running in your head in order to generate those predictions is a totally separate question, and one that I think, for the reasons that you're laying out, seems much less likely to be true, but that compositionality is at least useful as a descriptive account of sort of external behavior, even if it's not adequate to explain everything that we do in distribution, or what's, you know, as people keep saying, what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, it's a sort of a kind of something you can evaluate with respect to certain specific criteria, but you may find that people aren't strictly compositional in that way, right? So anyway,
yeah, no, absolutely, and you know, and in the context of the work that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk, one thing that we found is that, you know, models do make errors, and sometimes even not human-like errors, in sort of building these things that we're hypothesizing are functioning as their internal meaning representations in the first place. There's almost certainly not a like pure compositional representation generating process that lives inside these models that's producing these things that we think are meaning representations, or that's consuming them downstream to produce predictions. So, you know, I think it's possible to have things that look like structured representations of meaning or representations of situations alongside interpretation processes that are clearly not compositional.
Kelly, you're next if you'd like to respond. I'll bring the discussion some results.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to restate and maybe elaborate on what I see as like again, two very related, but not the same issue. And I just see a lot of debates on this where things all get kind of intertwined, and it can make it hard to make progress, in particular on some of the key issues that come up in something like neural nets as models of cognitive science, right? So one is the question of representations and testing hypotheses about representations. And I know putting up something like a photo definition in this kind of a group is a little bit provocative. And I do this intentionally. And I actually personally, like my background, feel fairly strongly in the camp of most of human language processing is not compositional, right? Like that's actually my personal belief about what ultimately, like based on, I don't know, faith or something, what ultimately the model will look like. Of course, we'll see what the data shows. But I don't think we can make progress on that question if we're not even able to entertain the hypothesis that maybe what's going on is something like a photo definition, right? Otherwise, we've just written neural networks out for people who believe that compositionality in that type of sense plays some role in some part of language understanding. So even if it's some component somewhere, we would need to show that neural networks can do it somewhere. And so I think that there's it's important to be able to say, what would it mean? How would we know if the neural network did it? Right. And I think we really need the tools to do that. So whether or not you endorse that this is in play a little bit completely or not at all, I think we need to have a story for what it would look like in the best case. I guess a fair story is neural networks can't do this. It is not a part of what neural networks are. And that would be a fine stance to take. But I actually don't think that that is the case. I think there is a story to tell about how neural networks could have something that looks a lot more like this kind of traditional compositionality story than what maybe the neural networks of the 1980s might have appeared to be the case. And then the second thing is, so like, I guess my pipe dream of what this kind of research direction shows is we eventually do have neural networks that are actually a really good have really good explanatory power for humans' linguistic behavior, right? So for things like how do we deal with these kind of odd sentences that seem to violate certain kinds of compositions, arbitrary new noun phrases, what have you. And if we did have a neural network with strong explanatory power there, if we don't have good representational tools, it's not very helpful for cognitive science, right? Because we want a story of what is it that people are doing when they get these new inputs. And so if all we can say is like, here's the 500 million or 500 billion parameters, that's the story, right? Like that's not very satisfying to us. And so if we have these kinds of tools where we can say, okay, look, I see that this neural network has pretty good predictive power for how humans are going to understand this unseen noun compound or something. I can say, here are the concepts that were in play. Here are the syntactic mechanisms that were in play. Here are the ones that weren't in play. Like that tells us a story for what went on under the hood. So I just feel like these representational tools are just absolutely essential to being able to move this kind of work forward in a meaningful way. And yeah, I guess that's all.
Wonderful. And before moving on to the next question and topic, I'd love to create space to hear from Grace and Ishita on this.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of ask, building on that, I feel like maybe you could wrap the representations up in with the behavior and say that it's not exhibiting human behavior if it doesn't have representations that kind of match the steps, the under the hood, that is happening in humans. But to me, they're naturally kind of separate. Like you could have a model that from the output of it, the natural output of it that you're interested in, production of language, whatever it may be, is producing human-like behavior. And then there's an open question of if it's doing the same thing as humans under the hood. And it seems totally fine to me that there could exist a model that in a large number of cases is producing human behavior such that we kind of say it is matching human behavior, but it's doing it with a different mechanism. And I guess to me, as someone who comes more from neuroscience, that's not useful to me because I want to know the neural mechanisms that humans use. And so I want to build these models and make them as much like the brain as I can. But I could imagine that for other use cases, obviously for applications, it doesn't matter. So I just don't know from the more cognitive science perspective, If it's, can you separate those, and can you have a model that's doing something different under the hood and still have it be interesting to you?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, I totally agree. The idea that that are not totally correlated. And I was sort of curious also about. I do think that thinking about representation and behavior separately, I think they can kind of feed into each other in really interesting ways. That, like, if you're thinking about representation, then you come up with behavioral tests, and behaviors can give you insights into what representations might underlie that behavior. So one thing that I wanted to, in this debate about whether humans are truly compositional and whether they truly are systematic, one thing that I feel like we don't yet have an analogy for neural networks, I'm curious what people think, is that there seems to be some effect of deliberation in humans, that there are certain things that seem to confuse humans on first blush, but then you give them a little bit more time, and then they're like, okay, I see how this works out logically, and like they can improve their estimates in some way. And like a lot of the things that sort of violate compositionality kind of fall in that bucket, like these kinds of sentences, like the horse raced past the barn fell. Like when you first read the sentence, you're like immediately confused, and then you have to go back and like revisit the sentence and say, okay, I see how that grammatically makes sense. It's not how I first parsed it. So I'm sort of like, yeah, that like what might, maybe they're sort of going into a different direction, but like I'm just sort of like, are we at a place where we have like what might things something like that look like for a neural network? Like what are like currently, like do people think that we actually have different systems, that like system 1, system 2 type reasoning are like, how do these sort of arguments and about representations and in humans, like how does that sort of mesh with our current understanding of neural networks?
Great. Paulina, thanks for raising your hand. Feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? All right. Yeah, my question is a little bit in different direction. I hope it's okay to go away from compositionality a little bit. So I was wondering what exactly we can learn essentially from representations that are learned only on text and on very large amounts of text compared to what we usually assume about the amount of data that humans or children are exposed to before they are able to perform at a mature level linguistically. So I know it's a very broad question, but I'd really be interested in hearing your thoughts.
And the panelists, feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to. Jay had his hand up.
Go ahead, Ellie.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'll happy to take a first stab, and then I'd love to hear Jacob's thoughts. So, I think this, again, the kind of success of large neural networks on text, I think is something where maybe some of the obvious bad things about that model mask some, or about models like GPT-3 mask some of what I view as the real successes of GPT-3. So when I see something like GPT-3, personally, I get excited about, or any of these large language models, I get excited about the potential of neural networks to model something like human behavior, not because actually of the language processing success, but because of what it tells us about the ability of the model to learn good abstract representations within that architecture from data that are useful for the task. So what GPT-3 to me, or any of these models, tells me is that a similar architecture trained on a different task with more realistic data could similarly learn probably implicit abstract structures and other kinds of like, non-trivial I don't know, statistical or collocational data that actually has this kind of power, right? So like when we look at something like GPT-3 learning really advanced syntactic processing, which is something that people would have earlier argued, people like Fodor would have earlier argued neural networks wouldn't be able to do, right? It says that like, oh, these models actually are able to learn these really abstract structures just from the kind of basic neural network learning mechanism. I can't imagine there's anyone who's arguing that GPT-3 should be seen as a viable model of any part of human language or human cognition because of the mechanistic question, right? Like it can't possibly be evolutionarily or developmentally a story of where human language processing came from. But I think it's very exciting as a story of the power of neural networks to learn what are really non-trivial representations that enable non-trivial behavior. So that's what I would say. I think that there is a very interesting question to ask about. I think the kind of buzzword is the isomorphic representations, like whether a model trained on text can learn something that's kind of isomorphic to the representations that you'd get from the world. But to me, that's a very interesting computer science, machine learning, NLP problem. It's just not a cognitive science problem because I can't see how that could bear on anything about the human brain. But I think it's a very deep, interesting question, just not really a cognitive science one. Those are my 2 thoughts.
Okay, the first thing I was going to say is the last thing that Ellie said, just to reiterate, like really interesting sort of scientific / philosophical question, what you can learn from text alone, not obviously a cognitive science question. And, I think that the important thing here is that there's, when we talk about having sort of adult-like human language processing abilities, that's the result of 2 different optimization processes or learning processes, right? There's the optimization problem that evolution solves to equip you with whatever priors and learning machinery and social context you have built in that allow you to then, within the span of an individual lifetime, with all this sort of rich perceptual, social, whatever context, do language learning. And the optimization problem that current neural network models solve collapses those 2 things together, right? On one hand, we are asking GPT-3 or whatever else to learn almost totally from scratch everything about language, and so there's no there's no analog to the thing where evolution to a first approximation has never seen English and yet is able to produce people that can learn English. GPT-3 has seen nothing but English, and so the interesting questions become. And maybe even then the interesting cognitive questions become, if you think of GPT-3 just as solving the evolution-like problem, right, where it's presented with some set of structured stimuli in some particular order with some particular frequency distribution, do you learn general purpose computational mechanisms that allow you to do general purpose cognitive things like sort of in context learning, fine tuning, and all the more interesting, like general purpose machine learning stuff that we see in these big language models that I think have now gotten like the vision world and the robotics world as excited about these models as in the NLP world itself. So I think, the interesting cognitive question about these really big language models actually is sort of independent of the fact that they're being trained on language, other than that language is a nice, like, structured source of data with interesting statistical properties that seem to give rise to more general purpose pattern recognition.
Okay, if you'd like to respond or offer your own thoughts. Latest question.
So Judy, I want you to be asking the audience to chime in, and I think that's super important and interesting. My comment is a relatively brief one, and goes back to what Ishita was saying about deliberation. I just wanted to put into people's thoughts the following thing that's been very prominent to me the last few years, which is that the ability to deliberate and think compositionally in the explicit way that trained logicians and philosophers and mathematical linguists like Chomsky can do is not necessarily an inherent characteristic of the human mind, but an acquired ability that comes from immersion in contexts in which, systems of thought that rely on these ideas have been constructed and perfected. And Lila Gleitman made an observation in her PhD thesis that consistent with this that I just think it's useful for everybody to keep in mind. So she asked people to interpret 3-word phrases like black birdhouse or hill house bird. And what she found was that only people with PhDs or who were students in PhD programs in subjects like linguistics and philosophy were actually able to systematically interpret these things according to the system of structure-sensitive rules that she had thought everybody would be using. And, you know, the secretaries that worked in the same departments as these professors and PhD students couldn't do it at all. So when we interpret language itself, we may be sometimes bringing to bear acquired cognitive traits that actually come from the systems we've used to analyze them and tried to make explicit what the principles are that are sort of latently in there somehow, but not necessarily the things that are driving our thought unless we sort of immerse ourselves in learning how to use them for that purpose. So, end of my comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to make a remark relating back to Paulina's original question about, you know, what can we learn from these models when they have, you know, trained just from large corpuses of text or whatever, because this comes up also in the context of, you know, vision models, when people say this is unnatural training data or too much training data, or the learning rule is not biological, and so therefore what can we learn from these models? And I think that actually relates to the question of if there are multiple solutions to the problem or not, because you could imagine if there's kind of only one way to produce human-like behavior or human-like language presentation, then no matter what data or optimization method you use, you're going to be funneled to that answer, that one solution. If there are multiple ways to get the same behavioral output, then doing a very different optimization method on, you know, not the right data distribution, then you're going to settle on something that's very different probably. And obviously we can't always know kind of how many solutions there are or even a way to describe or quantify that question. But I think that's where you have to be concerned, and that's what makes models that are pushing more at the limits of actually capturing a lot of human behavior more promising, because the assumption is the more difficult the task is, the fewer solutions there will be. You know, you can solve a simple problem probably with 1 million different neural network configurations, but something as difficult as producing human-like long-form text or doing all of human-like visual behavior, there's just kind of a belief that that's going to have more limited solutions, and therefore whatever means you need to get there, because we can't recapitulate the whole biological process, at least not yet, then, you know, that might still get you at a solution that's useful enough.
Yeah. What I was going to say was, yeah, the same, the idea that there might be multiple solutions. Also, when we talk about mechanism, whether the way that we got to that mechanism, whether it's part of that mechanism or not, is sort of up for grabs. Like, I know that there are some of these analyses at the neural level, right? Like people who are looking at the current dynamics of these large language models, transformer models, tying them back to language processing in the brain, etc. But I don't think even these accounts are saying that they arrived at it in the same way. That there could still be like multiple ways to arrive, even at the same neural mechanism. Forget, like, definitely at the same behavior. Like it's sort of like a narrowing funnel. So it's kind of, yeah. So that was basically the thing I wanted to say. And the additional quick point I wanted to make was, I think it would be really interesting in addressing these questions to, again, think about like, what are the minimal, like all of these are super emergent properties, right? So which make it really difficult to do causal manipulations on them, because you have to retrain it on the internet every time. And so like, if there are slightly better controlled settings in which we can figure out, like, isolate what mechanisms we want to try and replicate. Yeah, I think the fact that we have an artificial system that replicates some of these is super cool. Still not practical to just retrain it every time you want to do an experiment. So like, I think that's like a really interesting direction of like what are simpler experimental paradigms in which we can do those causal manipulations using these transformers.
Awesome. So thanks everybody who's contributed so far in various ways to this event. I'm going to conclude the main recorded portion of the event now. And what I'll do is I'll pose the question that I received from one of our audience members in the chat, but then immediately transition to breakout rooms.
The recording has stopped.
Okay, good. Double confirmation. Excellent. So that you can contemplate this question with the other members of your breakout room. Okay, so the question from the audience is, how concerned should we be that the core underlying learning mechanism in artificial neural networks, backprop, is not plausible in animal brains? Something that, Grace, in your comments you briefly alluded to, but something we can explore further in smaller groups. So everyone should have just received an invitation to join a breakout room. Enjoy.